Hi, welcome back. Today we're going to continue reading Peak, starting with chapter 12. Just a quick recap of the events that happened last time we read. Peak has finally made it to base camp with Zopa and another boy his age named Sunjo. And Peak is a little bit mad at his dad right now because he just found out that Josh hired a reporter to come cover the story about Peak summoning Everest because he will be the youngest person to have summoned Everest after that happens, which makes him feel like maybe his dad only bailed him out of his predicament in New York so that he could make money off of him climbing Everest and not so much because he was his son and he cared about him. So, chapter 12 will pick up right there. Chapter 12, Rock Weasels. Rather than confront Josh, I crawled into my tent, wrapped myself in my sleeping bag, and fell asleep. I know what you're thinking. Chicken! Maybe you're right. But what was I going to say? I will not be used, father. Or how about this? Send me back to New York so I can do my time. Take that, Dad. Besides, I needed some sleep before I talked to him. Walking around at 18,000 feet wears you down. And it turned out that I didn't have to find him because he found me. You awake? He asked. Yeah, I said, although I hadn't been until he stuck his head into my tent. He crawled in and zipped the flap closed. Did you get a chance to look around the camp? A little. There's a lot of competition for your company up here. You noticed, huh? Next year there won't be so many commercial operations. There's only a finite number of people who have the money, time, and desire to get up this mountain. This will be the last year for a lot of the operations. Including peak experience? I asked. He grinned. Your mom told me that you're smart, he said. I guess you got that from her. Flattery has never worked on me. So, how much trouble are you in? Like the judge said, I look good on paper, but the truth is I'm in debt up to my crevasse. Humor, on the other hand, always worked on me. I laughed. If we have a good season this year, he continued, we might be able to recoup some of our losses next year. It's all riding on how many people we get to the summit in the next few weeks and how much publicity we get. Which is why I'm here, I said. He gave me a sheepish look. Not entirely, he said, but yeah, that's one of the reasons. That's the main reason, I thought. Might as well get it over with. If I had been 15, would you have come to New York? He hesitated, then said, Probably not. I was right in the middle of leading a group of amateur climbers to Everest. I would have liked it a lot better if he had come to New York to save me because I was in trouble, not because he was in trouble. The youngest Americans to top Everest are a couple of 20-year-olds, he explained. So your being 15 might have worked, but truthfully, getting a 14-year-old up there has a lot more sex appeal, especially after your climb in New York. There are a lot of celebrities climbing this year, a couple of rockers, an actor, a football player. There are 7 documentary and TV crews on this side of the mountain alone, and just as many, if not more, on the south side. So, when we tried to get the media interested in our climb, there were no takers. Without publicity, we're circling the drain. Your skyscraper stunt was beamed all over the world. I knew about it before your mom called and asked if I could help out. Someone in our Chiang Mai office saw it on TV, figured out the connection, and called up here suggesting we try to put you out on top. At first I told them no way, but then your mom called. I thought I could take care of your problem and mine at the same time. Did you talk to Mom about what we're doing? Yeah, before I left Kathmandu. What did you tell her? I told her I was going to take you on a climb, but I didn't tell her where. She's not going to like it when she finds out. Don't be so sure. She may not climb anymore, but she understands what it's all about. That's why she let you go to those climbing camps. She knows that I might risk my own life to summit, but I would never risk anyone else's, especially my own son's, to get to the top of a mountain. What's going to make her mad is you're not telling her beforehand, I said. You're probably right, but the reason I didn't tell her is that we can't let this out until you're back down. What about the film crew? They're not going to say anything. We're paying them. They work for us. What about Holly Angelo? He gave a deep, foggy sigh. It was cold in the tent. Blackmail, he said, or what amounts to it anyway. Somehow she figured it all out. I think she might have a line to Dr. Wu. And, by the way, if you had flunked the physical, I wouldn't have brought you up here. Period. I would have sent you on to Chiang Mai, and I did enroll you in the international school there. Anyway, Holly called me here last week and said that she was going to print a story about your Everest attempt unless I gave her an exclusive. And now she wants to climb the mountain herself, I said. Yeah, and it looks like I'm going to have to give her a shot. Otherwise, she's going to start filing reports as soon as she gets up here. Why do we have to keep it quiet? Because of the Chinese, he said. There's no age limit on this side of the mountain, but if they find out we're trying to put a 14-year-old on the top, they might pull our climbing permit. They've been trying to get a teenager to the summit for years. They wouldn't be too happy if an American teenager topped it before one of their own. He let out a harsh laugh. Politics, publicity, advertising, sponsorships, endorsements. Climbing has really gone downhill. I can't tell you how much I miss our rock rat days when we showed up at the base of a wall with a bag of trail mix, a bottle of water, and an old rope. We are rock weasels now, and it will never be the same. Josh! A high-pitched scream pierced the cold mountain air. That would be Holly, Josh said. You know her voice? I haven't heard it in 15 years, but I'd recognize it anywhere. Kind of like fingernails scraping on a chalkboard. Josh! We both winced. Holly was on the circuit writing freelance articles when your mom and I were climbing. She actually wrote a couple of good pieces about us. She climbed too. Kind of. He shook his head. It was a scary thing to watch. Josh! So, I'll take you to the top, Josh said, but only if I can do it without killing you. If you make it, you'll be famous, and you'll help your old dad live in comfort for the rest of his life. My plan is to sell the business in a few years and retire on the proceeds. Are we square? I wasn't sure about the famous part, and I wasn't happy about his reason for bringing me to Everest, but I did want to get to the top. We're square, I said, but no more caginess. I want to know what's going on. It's a deal. He stuck out his gloved hand and we shook. Josh! He unzipped the flap and peeked out. We'd better go and say hello before she causes an avalanche. Chapter 13. Gasp. Holly Angelo looked like a red-headed scarecrow dressed in a pink goose down. She was over 6 feet tall with limbs like Daddy Longlegs. As soon as she saw Josh, she wrapped her arms around him with a shriek so loud every head for a quarter mile popped out of its tent like turtles coming out of their shells. Standing next to her were several curious Sherpas, 3 camera guys, a personal chef, and a massage therapist. The chef and the massage therapist were shivering and would be dead before morning unless someone found them warmer gear. Josh wriggled out of her tentacles and held her at arm's length so she couldn't snag him again. You haven't changed a bit, he said with his trademark grin, meaning, I think, Holly, you are still a pain in the crevasse. Her hawk-like brown eyes darted around for her next victim, which happened to be me. Peek! Luckily, the drawn-out version of my name doubled her over with a coughing fit, and she wasn't able to get to me. You would think that her chef or massage therapist would have come to her aid, but they just stood there shivering, watching their employer bent over, clutching her knees. Bad cough, Josh said when she was finally able to right herself. No big, gasp, deal. You know, gasp, the altitude, and gasp, dry air, gasp. We'll have Dr. Krieger take a look at you. He was still smiling, but the grin looked a little more genuine. He did not want to take Holly Angelo up the mountain any farther than he had to. In her current condition, it didn't look like she was going to get very far. I followed him over to meet the film crew. JR, Will, and Jack. They all looked fit. He thanked them for coming up. Happy to be here, JR said, then whispered, Do us a favor, Josh. Put us as far away from Holly as possible. No problem. Josh looked over at the gasping reporter. Holly was already telling the Sherpas where to pitch her pink tent, which was only slightly smaller than the HQ tent. Josh frowned when he saw that she was erecting the monstrosity right next to his and my tent, but didn't say anything to her. He looked back at JR and pointed to a spot about 75 feet away. Best I can do. Fine, JR said. He and the others headed over to the spot with their gear. Josh rubbed his temples. I probably don't need to tell you this, but you need to be very careful about what you say to Holly. She's a reporter, and anything you tell her is fair game. Just remember that she is more interested in herself and her career than she is in you. What about the film crew? I asked. No worries there. We own the footage. When we edit it down, we'll make you look good no matter how you screw up. He grinned. Just kidding. Let's go over to the mess tent and I'll introduce you to the other climbers. Just keep in mind, they know you're my son, but we haven't told them that we're trying to get you to the top. Why? Because they've paid upward to $100 grand to Summit. In a way, we're using their money to get you up there. They might get upset. So what am I supposed to tell them? That you're here with me and don't expect to make it past Camp 4 or 5. He looked back over in Holly's direction. I guess I better fill her in too, so she keeps her big mouth shut. I'll meet you over at the mess tent. He sighed, then put on his charming grin again, and headed towards Holly, who was shrieking orders at the Sherpas. The Sherpas, for the most part, were ignoring her every command. The mess tent was nearly as big as the HQ tent, but a lot more crowded. It was also smoky from the kerosene lamps and stoves and cigarettes. None of the clients were smoking, but almost every Sherpa had a cigarette dangling out of his mouth as he stood to the side holding a plate of food. Sunjo was manning the noodles. I went over to say hello. How's it going? What was that terrible sound outside? He asked. A reporter. Injured? Not yet. I looked around and noticed Zopa wasn't there. Where's Zopa? Sunjo shrugged. The climber walked over and held out his plate. Sunjo scooped some noodles onto it with a big smile. The man sniffed the pile, grunted, then walked away. What do you think of your fellow climbers? Sunjo asked. I didn't like that guy, I said, then looked around the tent and did a head count. 7 women, 16 men, including the rude grunter. 10 of them had signed up for a summit attempt. I tried to pick out which ones they were, but it was hard to figure out. Fitness helped, but getting through the death zone was more about your blood oxygenation and luck, things even the fittest climber had absolutely no control over. Most of the climbers appeared to be in their 30s or early 40s, and of these, only 5 or 6 looked in good enough shape to get to the top. I could see why Josh was worried about the climbing season. I told Sunjo that I was surprised to see the Sherpas smoking. Most of them believe they will die on the mountain, he said, so why not enjoy themselves while they wait? But doesn't smoking mess up their climbing? Only if they run out of tobacco, Sunjo answered, but Zopa brought up several cartons of cigarettes to sell to them. Monks weren't supposed to use any stimulants. I guess this rule didn't preclude them from selling them. Don't look so surprised, Sunjo said. Zopa will give the profits to the Tibetan monks. They are very poor. As you saw on the way here, the Chinese are not favorable towards them. KG monk reason number 2, I said. What? Never mind, I said. I guess I'd better mingle with the other climbers. Do you want some noodles? They are very good. Sure, they were good. I'm not much of a mingler, which drove Rolf crazy, since he is perhaps the greatest mingler on the planet. I have seen him go up to a complete stranger and ask for the time, even though Rolf always has a perfectly good watch on his wrist, just to get a conversation started. But I don't think even Rolf could have cracked this crowd. They had been at base camp for a couple of weeks now, and had bonded into inseparable groups. This wasn't the first time I'd run into this. GSS always got out late for summer. By the time I arrived at climbing camp, the other kids had already picked out their climbing partners. This left me with the kids who had virtually no previous climbing experience, or if I was lucky, the climbing instructor. Vincent told me that good riders are lousy minglers. They are too busy eavesdropping, or as he put it, gathering grist for their literary mills. So, because no one was paying an iota of attention to me, I just wandered around gathering grist. We should have been up at ABC by now. ABC stands for Advanced Base Camp, which is the next permanent camp up the north side of the mountain. We would have been if Josh hadn't ditched us for his so-called son. The so-called son was standing 5 feet away from the 2 guys talking. I didn't even know he had a son. Neither did I, and I read every article ever written about him before I plopped down my life savings. I hear the reason we're stuck down here is because he's waiting for a film crew and reporter from New York. They came in today. No film, no glory, I guess. Josh is a publicity hound. Dr. Leah Krieger is the coldest fish I've ever met. Straight from Nazi Germany, if you ask me. I think she's here to perform experiments on us, not treat us. Poor George. Do you think he really had a heart condition? I don't know, but I heard that George's wife begged Krieger to put in a bad report. She never wanted him to climb the mountain in the first place, and she's the one with all the money. Before they got married, George didn't have 2 pennies to rub together. I wandered over to William Blade's camp this morning. I couldn't tell if I saw him or not, but I think I got close because one of his bodyguards rushed over and blocked my way as I tried to walk past his tent. Think he'll make it to the top? He already has, as far as I'm concerned. You know what I mean. The summit. If he can't do it on his own 2 feet, his bodyguards are big enough to carry him up there on their backs. William Blade was a famous actor. I'd seen most of his films and thought he was great. I heard there are 3 people up at ABC with HAPE. They're coming down tomorrow. Well, they're luckier than the guy who died on the south side yesterday, stepped out of his tent in the middle of the night to pee. Idiot was wearing slippers. He slid 200 yards down a slope into a crevasse so deep the Sherpas say he's probably still falling. He should have been wearing crampons. Or at least carrying his axe so he could self-arrest. Self-arrest has nothing to do with law enforcement. It's one of the first things they teach you in mountaineering. If you start sliding down an icy slope with nothing to grab onto, you'd better know how to stop yourself by digging in your crampons, or punching your axe into the ice and hanging on for dear life. All steep slopes end badly, in trees, solid walls, or deep holes. Screaming in terror doesn't slow you down one bit, one of my instructors told me. If you want to live, you better learn to avoid the void. Self-arrest wasn't my best climbing skill. Hearing about a guy dying because he stepped out to go to the bathroom made my skin crawl. Josh is so cute. What do you think he'd do if I snuck into his tent one night? I don't think that's included in the permit fee. If you wait until you're above 20,000 feet, nothing will happen, more than your lungs shut down at. The most interesting part of my grist gathering got cut off by the entrance of Holly Angelo. Hello, everyone! My name is Holly Angelo. I'm a journalist from New York, and I'll be joining you on top of the world. Holly did not mingle. She mangled. Her gasps were met with other gasps, not because of the thin air, although a lot of the oxygen was sucked out of the mess tent when she walked in. All conversation stopped. A plate of food dropped. The Sherpa nearly swallowed the cigarette he was smoking, then made a mad dash for the back entrance with 5 or 6 other Sherpas. I was going to join them, but I was too slow. Talons with bright red fingernail polish lashed onto my parka. Where do you think you're going? Holly whipped me around to face her with surprising strength. I stammered. I need to talk to you. Okay. Now, I have seen your pitiful tent, and I think you'll be a lot more comfortable in my tent. I thought I would faint. I have a lot of room, an extra cot. No one hauled a cot all the way up to base camp, but she had a spare. And my food is much better than this swill. Pierre is creating something right now, and Ralph has his massage table set up if you need a rub down. Your father said it was up to you. Thanks, Dad. Coughing fit. I thought about sneaking out while she was coughing. She would straighten up, and old Peak would be just gone. Poof! Then I thought about what Josh had told me. Be very careful about what you say, and figured that it also applied to what I did. It's rude to disappear when someone is hacking their lungs out. We have so much to discuss, she said when the fit was over, which seemed to have helped her gasping. Your mom and I go way back. We've been friends for years. If that had been the case, I would have recognized her name the first time I saw it in the byline above the article she'd written. She would never forgive me if I didn't watch out for you up here. I appreciate the offer, I said, trying to give her my version of Josh's charming grin, which probably looked more like a scowl. But I think I'll stay in my own tent. This was returned with a genuine scowl. I didn't care. There was no way I was going to become her tent mate. But you will have your meals with me, she said, as if this wasn't even open to question. I was holding the plate of noodles, which had cooled and congealed and wasn't looking at its best at the moment. Not every meal, I hedged, but yeah, I'll eat with you once in a while. Her scowl deepened, and I think she was about to say something nasty, but I was saved by Josh coming into the tent. Okay, people, he announced. Tomorrow we head up to ABC. A cheer went up. It'll take us 3 days and 2 nights to get up there if everything goes well. We'll spend 2 nights at ABC, then come back down. You know the routine. Climb high, sleep low, the team chanted in unison. Leo will check you tonight to get a baseline on your blood, etc., then check you again up at ABC to see how you're doing. This news was met with much less enthusiasm. She's waiting for you in the aid tent. He pinned a sheet of paper on the tent pole. She wrote down your exam times. Don't be late. Hail Hitler, a climber muttered under his breath. Josh shot him a look, and he turned bright red. Nobody got up to the summit unless the expedition leader said they were going up. It was best to stay on the captain's good side. What about the puja ceremony? Someone asked. A puja is a Buddhist blessing ritual that most climbing parties went through prior to going up the mountain. We will be going up to ABC 2 more times in the next few weeks, Josh said. We'll hold our puja before one of those. I want to get an early start tomorrow. A couple of the Sherpas didn't look too happy about skipping the puja. Pack just enough food for the trip, Josh continued. It will be a hard climb and you don't want to be carrying any more weight than necessary. The speech ended and the climbers gathered around the sheet. Josh walked over to Holly and me. You two won't be coming, he said. I'm holding JR, Jack, and Will back too. You haven't acclimatized enough to go higher. Then why don't you wait a few days, Holly asked. We can all go up together. It was a good question, mostly because I couldn't imagine being stuck in camp alone with Holly for the next several days. Josh lowered his voice. I'd like nothing better than to wait, but most of these people have been here for weeks. If I don't get them higher, they'll riot. A third of them have only signed up for ABC. When we come back down, they're gone, which will make things a lot easier around here. I'll take you up to ABC as soon as I get back down. I can't hold them back because of latecomers. Chapter 14. Latecomers. Josh's absence wasn't as bad as I thought, although Zopa worked Sunjo and me like dogs. The morning Josh headed up the mountain, he had us build a 6-foot-tall cairn out of rocks around a central flagpole for the puja blessing ceremony. We then placed smaller poles in the ground around the main pole and strung up dozens of prayer flags between them on strings. The flags come in 5 colors, red, green, yellow, blue, and white, representing the Earth's 5 elements, fire, wood, earth, water, and iron. As the flags flutter in the wind, they release the prayers written on them and pacify the gods. When we finished, Josh had Sunjo and me gather gear from our team's tents and lean it against the cairn to be blessed. Zopa held the ceremony that evening for a German and Italian climbing party going up the next morning, and for our group in absentia, which he said wasn't ideal, but it sometimes worked. He recited several Buddhist prayers, then asked the mountain for permission for us to climb it, in German, English, and Italian, which was impressive. Their ceremony took about 3 hours, and just as it was ending, a blackbird landed on the main flagpole, which Zopa said was very auspicious. What kind of bird was that? I asked as we headed back to camp. It looked like a crow or a raven. Sunjo shrugged. It turned out that even though Holly Angela was right next door to me, she was relatively easy to avoid. She never left her tent before 10. I was out of mine by 7 every morning. Because there were so many people in the camp, it was easy to get lost among the tents unless you were Holly, who wore the most garish-colored snowsuits on the slope. I could pick her out a mile away and hide. She did manage to snag me for dinner the 4th night Josh was gone. I made the mistake of heading back to my tent to drop off my ice axe before dinner. Zopa had been giving Sunjo and me self-arrest lessons, and Holly was waiting for me like a guard dog. The food was better than what they offered in the mess tent, but the atmosphere was grim. Ralph sat on his massage table with a permanent pout on his face, as if he were waiting for customers he knew would never come. Chef Pierre watched every bite of food I took and mothered about the barbaric cooking conditions at 18,000 feet. And Holly, well, my headache came back, but it wasn't from the altitude. Inside the tent, her voice was shrill enough to sour yak butter. She was no longer gasping, which I missed because the pauses gave my ears a chance to rest. I thought she was going to interview me, but it turned out that I was there to listen to her interview herself. During the 2-hour non-stop monologue, she filled me in on her life, year by boring year. I didn't really start tuning in until she turned 18, but even then, it wasn't very interesting. She'd been married 3 times, and her current husband lived in Rome, and she barely saw him. She came from a wealthy family and didn't have to work for a living. She became a journalist, as she called it, against her father's wishes because she felt it was her moral responsibility to tell the truth. I didn't mention in the article that she'd written about us there were several things that were blatantly untrue. I also think she exaggerated her climbing conquests because when I asked her what mountains she had climbed, she said, "You know, all the big ones," and quickly changed the subject to dreams, asking if I ever have them. Yes. Well, let me tell you about one I had just last night, she said. I hate hearing about people's dreams, but I was spared by the arrival of William Blade and 3 bodyguards the size of Yetis. In his films, William Blade had been shot, stabbed, starved, beaten, and tortured, but he had never looked worse than when he hobbled into Holly's tent. His back went out, one of the bodyguards explained. We were wondering if your massage therapist can put him right. Of course, Holly said, pushing things out of the way, including me, to make room. Ralph smiled for the first time since he had arrived on the mountain and gleefully began laying out liniments and lotions and flexing his muscles, which weren't very impressive. I stayed long enough to watch him get Blade out of his clothes and onto the table, where he started yelling and swearing at everyone in the tent as if we were personally responsible for his bad luck. I didn't see what happened the next day. Zopa had Sunjo and me climbing a treacherous icefall outside camp, but we heard all about it when we got back that afternoon. After Ralph worked his magic on the film hero's back, Blade offered to pay him twice as much as Holly was paying to move over to his camp. Apparently, Ralph couldn't get his gear together fast enough. When Pierre saw this, he begged Blade to take him too, which he did, leaving Holly absolutely alone in her giant pink tent, screaming in rage. The bet was that she was going to quit the mountain. The only person who put cash down on her staying was Zopa. He met everyone's wager with the money he had gotten from his cigarette sales. It was hours after the incident before Holly emerged from her tent. It turned out that she wasn't about to head home to her Upper East Side penthouse apartment. We were in the mess tent waiting to hear from Josh and the team up at ABC. They were supposed to leave that morning for base camp, but got pinned down by a snowstorm. We had heard that some of the people up there had hate, but the storm had knocked out further radio communication, so we didn't know who was sick or how bad it was. If the team wasn't able to start down the next day, the situation would turn critical. They had only brought enough food for 2 days at ABC. A couple of the Sherpas were talking about hauling up some food for them. Not tonight, Zopa said. The storm is moving down the mountain. The Sherpas and a small number of other climbers were arguing with Zopa about this weather prediction when Holly sauntered into the mess tent. I'm going to the top, she announced calmly, then walked over and got a plate of food. The only person smiling was Zopa. And why not? He had just won a pot of money, literally. The mess cook had been keeping the bets in a 10-gallon rice cooker, which was now overflowing with rupees. Sunjo had told me that if Zopa won the bet, he could give the money to the Tibetan monks. They would have to wait to get their cash. I didn't know this yet, but just like Holly, Zopa had no plans to go home anytime soon. The snow is here, one of the Sherpas said. That's impossible, I said. I hadn't been in the tent more than 20 minutes. When I'd walked over from HQ, there wasn't a cloud in the sky. The cook pulled the flap back, and we stared outside in disbelief. The snow was so thick, I wasn't sure how I was going to find my tent. That's the end of chapter 14. We'll continue with chapter 15 in the next video.